I thought getting fired would be the worst thing that happened to me that year. I was wrong. Because the day my boss fired me, he looked more frightened than angry. Before I walked out of his office, he leaned toward me and whispered something I still remember word for word. "Whatever you do, don't open the bottom drawer of my desk." At the time, I thought he was trying to scare me. 3 days later, I understood why. Hi everyone, my name is Tom Holland, and today I'm going to tell you about the strangest job I ever had, the boss who suddenly fired me, and the secret I discovered after I thought my career was over. It all started when I was 32 years old. I had been working at a small accounting company in Chicago for almost 7 years. It wasn't my dream job, but I was good at it. I was careful with numbers, organized, and usually the person people trusted when something didn't look right. My life was simple. I went to work in the morning, came home in the evening, cooked dinner, watched television, and tried to save enough money to eventually buy my own home. Then, one Monday morning, I received an email from a company called Whitmore Financial. They were offering me a position as a financial records analyst. The salary was almost twice what I was making. I couldn't believe it. The strange thing was that I had never applied to the company. I had never contacted them. I had never spoken to anyone there. Yet somehow they had found my resume and wanted me to start within 2 weeks. I thought it was an incredible opportunity. So I went to the interview. That's when things became strange. The company's director, Richard Whitmore, barely asked me normal interview questions. He didn't ask much about my education. He didn't ask why I wanted the job. Instead, he looked at my resume for almost a minute. Then he looked directly at me. "Do you remember working on the Miller account in 2018? I immediately felt uncomfortable. "Yes," I said, "it was one of my first major accounts." He nodded slowly. "Good, that's one of the reasons I contacted you." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He offered me the job that same afternoon. I accepted. At first, everything seemed perfect. The office was modern. The employees were polite. The salary was excellent. And my new boss seemed professional. But after a few days, I noticed something unusual. Richard seemed strangely interested in me. Not my work. Me. Every few days, he would stop by my desk and ask what I was working on. Sometimes he asked questions that had nothing to do with my current job. "Did anyone ever ask you to change financial records? Did you notice anything unusual in 2018? Do you still have access to your old files?" I always answered honestly. "No. At least nothing unusual that I remember." Richard would simply nod. Then he would walk away. I couldn't understand why he cared so much about something that had happened years earlier. Then I received my first major assignment. Richard asked me to review several old financial records from 2017 and 2018. He said the company was preparing for an internal audit. The records were stored in an old digital archive. I spent several days going through them. Most of the numbers looked normal. But then I found something strange. There were payments listed under a company called Northbridge Consulting. Millions of dollars had been transferred over several years. The problem was that I couldn't find any evidence that Northbridge Consulting actually existed. There was no normal business address, no employee information, no website, nothing. It looked like a company that existed only on paper. I asked my supervisor about it. Her expression immediately changed. "Don't worry about those records," she said. "Why? Richard will explain. That answer made me even more curious. Later that afternoon, Richard came to my desk. He looked at my computer screen. The moment he saw the file, his face changed. "Who told you to look at those?" "You did." He stared at me for several seconds. Then he closed the file. "Forget about it." I was confused. "Why?" He didn't answer. He simply walked away. That was the first moment I realized something important. I hadn't been hired because I was especially talented. I had been hired for another reason. But I had no idea what that reason was. For the next 2 weeks, I continued working normally. Still, something felt wrong. People became quiet whenever I entered a room. My supervisor stopped discussing certain projects with me. And Richard started avoiding me. Then, on a Thursday morning, everything changed. Richard called me into his office. He was sitting behind his desk. The room was unusually quiet. He didn't ask me to sit. Instead, he said, "Tom, we're ending your employment effective immediately." I thought I had misunderstood him. "What? You're being let go? Why?" He looked down at the papers in front of him. Company restructuring. It didn't make sense. I had been hired only a few months earlier. My performance reviews were excellent. I had recently received a bonus. Did I do something wrong? No. Then why am I being fired? He didn't answer. He simply handed me an envelope containing my final paycheck. I was angry. I was confused. But then something happened that made the situation even stranger. Richard stood up. He walked around the desk. He came close to me and lowered his voice. "Tom, listen carefully." I looked at him. His eyes were nervous. "Whatever you do, don't open the bottom drawer of my desk." I stared at him. "What? The bottom drawer? Why? Just promise me." I didn't promise. Instead, I asked, "What is in there?" His face became pale. "Nothing you need to know about." Before I could ask another question, security came to escort me out. I left the building carrying a cardboard box containing my personal belongings. I was furious. For several days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Why had they hired me? Why had they fired me? And why had Richard specifically warned me about his desk? Then, 3 days later, I received a phone call. It was from my former supervisor. She sounded terrified. "Tom, are you home?" "Yes." "Don't tell anyone I called." My heart started beating faster. "What happened?" There was a long silence. Then she said, "Richard disappeared." I sat down. "What do you mean?" "He didn't come to work yesterday. His car was found outside his house. Maybe he went somewhere." "No." Her voice became quieter. "The police found his phone inside the car." I didn't know what to say. Then she added, "There was something else." "What?" "They found an old file with your name on it." My stomach tightened. "My name?" "Yes." "What kind of file?" "I don't know." "Where is it?" "I don't know, Tom." She suddenly sounded frightened. "I shouldn't have called you." Then she hung up. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, someone knocked on my apartment door. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. The knocking came again. Slowly. 3 times. I looked through the peephole. Nobody was there. I waited. Then I noticed something on the floor. A small brown envelope. I opened the door carefully and picked it up. There was no name on it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed me standing outside my old workplace in 2018. I had no memory of the photograph being taken. I turned it over. On the back, someone had written, "Now you know why they hired you." I immediately called my former supervisor. She didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. Then I made a decision. I was going back to Whitmore Financial. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I wanted revenge. But deep down, I knew I had to understand why my name was in those old files. The next morning, I went to the building. The front doors were locked, but I still had my old employee access card. I tried it. The door opened. The office was almost empty. It was Saturday. I walked directly toward Richard's office. His desk was still there. I stood in front of it and stared at the bottom drawer. The drawer he had warned me never to open. My hands were shaking. I pulled it. It was locked. For a moment, I almost walked away. Then I remembered the envelope. I searched through my pockets. There was a small key inside. I hadn't put it there. I immediately understood. The key had been hidden inside the envelope. I inserted it into the lock. The drawer opened. Inside was a thick folder. On the front were 2 words. Tom Holland. I sat down. My hands felt cold. I opened the folder. The first page was a copy of my resume. The second was a photograph of me as a teenager. The third was a newspaper article. I read the headline. It was about a financial investigation that had happened in 2018. Then I saw a name I recognized. Northbridge Consulting. My breathing stopped. I kept reading. The company had apparently been used to move illegal payments between several businesses. But there was more. Someone had reported the suspicious transactions. The report had come from my old company, and the person who first discovered the suspicious records was me. I couldn't believe it. I didn't remember. Then I saw the explanation. In 2018, I had been 24 years old. I had noticed unusual transactions while working on the Miller account. I reported them to my manager. An investigation started. But before it could go anywhere, several files disappeared. My company told me the matter had been resolved. I believed them. Apparently, it hadn't been resolved. Someone had erased the records. And someone had also convinced me that I had misunderstood what I saw. I was young. I trusted my managers. They told me the numbers were normal. They told me I had made a mistake. Eventually, I stopped asking questions. But Richard hadn't forgotten. He had spent years investigating what happened. And he believed I was the person who could help him prove it. I turned the page. There was a handwritten note. Tom didn't know the full story. He was used as a witness without realizing it. Then I found something that changed everything. A list of names. Business executives. Accountants. Bank employees. And at the bottom was Richard Whitmore. Beside his name was a handwritten note. Not responsible, cooperating. I suddenly understood. Richard hadn't hired me because he wanted to use me. He had hired me because he needed someone from the original investigation. Someone who had seen the numbers before they disappeared. Someone whose memory could connect the old records to the new ones. But if that was true, why had he fired me? I searched through the folder again. Then I found a letter. It was written by Richard. It began, "Tom, if you are reading this, I probably didn't have enough time to explain everything." I continued reading. "I fired you because someone inside the company discovered that I was investigating Northbridge again." I stopped. Then I read the next sentence. "They knew you were helping me, even if you didn't realize it." My hands began to shake. Richard hadn't fired me because I had done something wrong. He had fired me because he was trying to protect me. The letter continued. "I didn't fire you to punish you. I fired you because I believed they would stop watching you if they thought you were no longer involved." I sat there silently. Suddenly, every strange moment at the company made sense. The questions, the suspicious looks, the old records, the sudden firing. But the letter wasn't finished. Richard had one more warning. I was wrong about one thing. The person I trusted most was already working against me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the office. I froze. Someone was walking down the hallway. Slowly, one step at a time. The footsteps stopped outside Richard's office. Then I heard a voice. "Tom." It was my former supervisor. I opened the door. She was standing there. Her face looked terrified. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. "I found Richard's file." She closed her eyes. "Oh no." "What?" She looked behind her. "Someone followed me." My heart dropped. "Who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my arm. "We have to leave." We ran through the back exit. Once we were outside, she finally told me the truth. She had known about Northbridge for years. Richard had recruited her too. She had been helping him collect evidence. But someone had discovered their investigation. "Who?" I asked. She looked at me. Then she said a name I never expected. "My old manager." The same manager who had told me in 2018 that I had misunderstood the numbers. The same manager who had encouraged me to forget about Northbridge. The same manager who had recommended me for Richard's company. Suddenly, everything made sense. I hadn't randomly received that job offer. My old manager had recommended me. Richard had hired me because he knew I was connected to the original investigation. And my old manager had recommended me because she wanted to know exactly what Richard was discovering. I had unknowingly been placed in the middle of a 10-year-old financial cover-up. But there was one final twist. My former supervisor reached into her bag and handed me a USB drive. Richard gave me this 2 days before he disappeared. I looked at it. "What is on it?" "Everything." "Then why didn't you give it to the police?" She looked away. "Because the police report was leaked." I couldn't believe it. "Then who can we trust?" She looked directly at me. "No one inside the company." But we eventually gave the evidence to an independent investigator outside the company. Months later, the investigation became public. Several executives were arrested. Millions of dollars were recovered. My former manager disappeared before investigators could question her. But she was eventually found in another state. And Richard, he was found alive. He had been hiding because he believed someone was following him. The entire time, he had been trying to make sure the evidence survived. When I finally saw him again, I asked him one question. "Why me?" He smiled sadly. "Because you were the first person who noticed the truth." I told him I didn't remember. He shook his head. You didn't need to remember everything. You only needed to trust the part of you that knew something was wrong. That sentence stayed with me. Looking back, I realized the strangest part wasn't that I had been fired. It wasn't the secret drawer. It wasn't even the missing millions. The strangest part was that I had spent years believing I was wrong when, in fact, I had been right from the beginning. Sometimes we ignore our instincts because other people sound more confident than we do. We assume that if everyone around us says something is normal, then it must be normal. But sometimes that small feeling inside us, the feeling that says something doesn't make sense, is worth listening to. Losing that job felt like the biggest failure of my life. But losing it forced me to discover why I had been hired in the first place. And that changed everything. I never became rich from the investigation. I never wanted to. What I gained was something more important. I learned to question things. I learned that being told you're wrong doesn't always mean you are wrong. And most importantly, I learned that sometimes an unexpected ending is actually the beginning of the truth. So if you ever find yourself facing a situation that doesn't make sense, don't be afraid to ask questions. You may not have all the answers, but sometimes one simple question can uncover a story that someone has spent years trying to hide.